My name's Russell. I'm a member of staff at Houseman's Bookshop, and welcome to tonight's event. So for those of you who have never been or don't know, Houseman's is one of London's longest running and few remaining radical bookshops. So thank you so much for coming to support this event, even when our doors are still closed, although obviously things are looking more optimistic that this will we'll be moving back into seeing each other in person very soon. In fact, one of the panelists that was supposed to be with us tonight is not here because he's getting vaccinated, which is so exciting and fantastic for him. That's really, really great. So we're still operating a limited mail order service, so you can pick up tonight's book from us if you like. So do check out the website after the event to stock up on essential lockdown reading, just to get through the last few months. And some of that reading might be tonight's book. So we're pleased to welcome the author Jillian C York to Houseman's tonight to discuss her new book, Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. So this book is an exploration of how corporations and platforms exercise more control over our ability to access information and share knowledge than any state. It shows how big corporations have become unaccountable censors and the devastating impact this has had on those who have been censored. So Jillian is International Activism Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and she's also a founding member of the feminist collective Deep Lab. She's been covering questions of surveillance and freedom since the noughties. I think noughties is the standardized reference point for that decade now. I hope so. She was named by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 intellectuals on social media. She's written for a whole host of outlets, which I won't list here, and she's based in Berlin. And tonight she's in conversation with Tin Geber. He is managing director at Greenhost, a socially responsible digital infrastructure company, and he's a creative strategist and a technologist focused on supporting social change organizations to make the most of data and technology. So really well equipped to have a fantastic discussion with Jillian tonight. So feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat box just to get a bit of final housekeeping out of the way. But if you have a question for tonight, please put that in the Q&A box. That's where Tin will be fielding questions towards the end of the event and putting them to Jillian. And if you see a question you were going to ask, you can just upvote it rather than repeat it. And yeah, there'll be some time for this at the end. So that's all the housekeeping and all the introductions. So without further ado, please do join me in giving our guests an eerily, digitally silent, but nonetheless very warm virtual welcome. Thank you very much to Tin and Jillian.
We are feeling the bits and bytes of warmth somewhere in the ether. Thank you all for coming. And I am, everybody says, I'm thrilled to be part of whatever, but I am genuinely thrilled to be here for three main reasons. A, I read the book and it's fantastic. Two, it is incredibly important right now. And three, I don't get even close to enough time to spend with Jillian. So this is also a great opportunity to catch up. I want to say before we start that if you have any questions, don't feel like you need to wait until the end to ask them. Ask them whenever you want, and we will kind of check the Q&A as we go. And I will leave the floor over to Jillian that will read us part of the book. I'm very excited to hear that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tin. And thank you for being here. Adam, we miss you. Hope you're out there listening. So I do see a few people out in the audience, friends, folks who are acknowledged in the book. And it's so lovely to have you here. And thank you to the rest of you who took a chance on me. So without further ado, I'll just talk really briefly about how I came to this book, why I wrote it, and then I'll share with you a little reading from chapter 4, which is called Profit Over People. So I've been working on this issue for a little over 10 years, and I came upon it accidentally. When I was in my early 20s, I was teaching English in Morocco, as one does, and that's when I first encountered internet censorship. And of course, that was government censorship. Really, I kind of happened upon it because I was going to the cyber cafe, as we called it back then, on my very first night in town, about to post an update to my blog, which was a live journal, believe it or not. And when I went to the URL, livejournal.com, it just wasn't there. So I emailed some friends back home who were way more technical than I was and said, hey, what the heck is this? Sent them a screenshot and they were like, oh yeah, the government probably blocks it. And I was like, what do you mean the government blocks it? Because I'm from the US where not saying it's never happened, but it's not really a tactic to block websites. Typically, the US might seize domains, they might pressure private companies, as they did with WikiLeaks, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. But it was new to me. And so, long story short, read the book for the more details. I networked with a bunch of people from that country and abroad, and eventually was working at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where I was studying internet censorship, again at the government level, so direct path there. When sometime in early 2010, I got an email from a young man that I'd known in Morocco, who he's quoted in the book. He's a journalist these days in Switzerland, but back then he was writing to me because he said he was being censored by Facebook. I was like, what do you mean censored by Facebook? And it turned out that what had happened was he created a page that was advocating for the separation of religion and education. It was in French, and that page kept getting removed. He would start a new one, it would be systematically taken down. And the fact is, we never found out why that happened. We don't know if it was his government or the company. And that kind of opens up for me to dive into reading the book. That's kind of the whole point. So without further ado, I'm going to read a small portion from chapter 4, and then we'll go to some conversation, which I'm very excited about.
Awesome.
So this starts just after the Arab uprisings of 2011. As the year wore on and the situation across most of the region grew darker, the media remained caught in a jejune debate about whether the Arab uprisings could be attributed to social media. At the same time, attention toward the field of digital rights was growing. In 2011 alone, and this is true, I was invited to give at least 25 talks on social media and free expression. And now prominent conferences like RightsCon, which was then called the Silicon Valley Human Rights Summit, were launched. It felt as if all of a sudden, a new field had emerged. Meanwhile, the platforms kept growing. By the end of the year, Facebook had 845 million users, a 40% increase from the beginning of the year. Twitter, just 5 years old at the time, boasted 200 million daily active users by September. With more users came more employees. Between 2011 and 2012, Facebook grew from 3,200 to a little over 4,600 employees, a growth rate of 44%. Such significant growth brought with it big changes. In May 2012, Facebook Inc. went public. Its peak market capitalization was over 500 billion, one of the largest initial public offerings in history. As these platforms grew, the relationships between their policy teams and human rights activists became ever more fraught. At the same time, the monitoring and surveillance of social media was growing too, as governments grew increasingly savvy to what their citizens were doing online. It wouldn't be long before social media companies would be drawn into the cat and mouse game, and their power over the world's expression laid bare. Halfway around the world, and less than a month before Tunisians took to the streets in protest, a different sort of battle was brewing. WikiLeaks, then known for publishing national internet block lists, incidentally, documents from the secretive Scientology cult, and footage from a 2007 Baghdad airstrike, had just released a trove of diplomatic cables. The cables contained diplomatic assessments of world leaders and of their host countries. While many were quite mundane in their revelations, others demonstrated the depravity of certain governments, including Tunisia's. There, they were received with appreciation by activists, some of whom later credited WikiLeaks with pushing their movement forward. The US government, however, did not share in their enthusiasm, and just 24 hours after Senator Joseph Lieberman publicly called on companies not to host the site's content, they began booting WikiLeaks content from their servers. Amazon, which hosted the publication's site on its servers, was the first to comply, followed by Tableau, a software company that was hosting user-created visualizations of the leaks. And by the end of the following day, everydns.net, a domain name management service, had terminated the wikileaks.org domain, and PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard had barred donations to the project. The release of the cables was certainly controversial, but WikiLeaks had partnered with widely respected journalists from publications, including the New York Times and The Guardian, to prioritize the documents and redact critical information. Just as Daniel Ellsberg had done in the 1970s with the Pentagon Papers, WikiLeaks was blowing the whistle on injustice. But not everyone saw it that way. Pundits were quick to denounce the comparison. Ellsberg, they countered, had a specific target and furthermore had kept certain documents to himself. Ellsberg, on the other hand, saw the government's persecution of WikiLeaks as evidence that the United Nations was headed down a repressive path. Secrecy, he stated at the time, is essential to empire. Just one more small piece and then we'll move on. The actions of one company, Twitter, stood out amongst the rest. The US Department of Justice served it with a 2703D court order to hand over user data pertaining to 3 individuals related to WikiLeaks, giving the company just 3 days to reply without notifying anyone involved. But instead of complying, Twitter appealed and was granted permission by a judge to inform the users of the demand. Twitter introduced a new feature last month without telling anyone about it, and the rest of the tech world should take note and come up with its own version of it, wrote tech journalist Ryan Singal. Twitter beta tested a spine. But the actions taken by most Silicon Valley companies against WikiLeaks stood, at least to me, in stark contrast to how they sought to serve Tunisian and Egyptian users. Maybe the pressure from the government was too great, or maybe the companies only feigned support for the protests in the region because they saw potential to grow their bottom line there. Or perhaps it was just the soft bigotry of low expectations. In any case, by the end of 2011, the hope and optimism that had driven the Arab Spring was fading fast, as was the faith activists in the region once had in social media.
Thank you. That is, and everybody, please. Exactly, observe the cover. Thanks, Jillian. And full honesty and transparency, at this point, I kind of have to measure myself from just going and geeking out on this. So I might kind of stumble on like how I ask certain questions, because I have so many. I think for me, one thing that I really loved about the book is that it is a fantastic retelling of inflection points of the last decade, moments in time in which things just, radically changed in a certain way, especially around freedom of speech and around the corporate kind of role in that. I guess, so you kind of told us where this when this started for you, where this fire started to burn for you. What drove you to compile this account right now?
Yeah, well, so my editor's in the audience, hi Leo, and knows that I started compiling this account a few years ago and was slightly late on my deadline, as many writers apparently are, one learns. But no, I mean, really what it came down to when I started thinking about this, it was probably about, I don't know, my mom's in the audience, maybe she can tell us. I think it was about 2017. And really the conversation after Trump was elected in particular, well, let me go back a step and say that, those first few years when I was dealing with this stuff with WikiLeaks, I mean, it all felt very innocent. WikiLeaks was like the big one, but everything else that was going on wasn't getting a whole lot of attention in the media after the Arab uprisings. And really these companies were just doing a lot of things under the radar. And 3 things happened. I mentioned them all in the book, but the 2 big ones that I want to talk about now, one was the rise of the Islamic State, which really kind of reached a fever pitch in 2013 and 2014 after the events had begun in Syria. And then the second one, of course, was the rise of right-wing populism and the election of Trump. And so after Trump was elected in 2016, the media debate just got, in many ways, really dumb, for lack of a better term. And I just kept finding myself making the same arguments, repeating myself over and over again, as did many people in my field, certainly, and realized that I had a story to tell. And obviously, there's lots of other wonderful books out there. There were quite a few that came before mine, including Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism and Rebecca McKinnon's excellent book, Consent of the Network, which laid a lot of the groundwork for my thinking on this. But really, what I found frustrating about a lot of the conversations around that time, and still today, is just the US centricity of them, or often broader Western centricity of them. And the fact that a lot of the debate around what we should do about social media is focused around these high-level actors, Trump, even Burmese generals, as problematic as that situation is, and tragic, really. The people who are forgotten in all of these decisions are often the most vulnerable communities and users.
That is the point about US centricity is also something that that was, for me, it's like a struggle when I read the book because of how much of this is just inevitably US centric, and then I think, oh, it would be really so important and so valuable to find an alternative, and then my brain always goes back to the fact that yes, okay, but those corporations are based there, so there is a reason for which certain types of conversations happen because certain types of laws and legal frameworks fit there. But that is kind of more of a legal kind of policy conversation. But at the same time, we don't really have an international global framework of any sorts to kind of counteract that, right? But if we did, like the example of the GDPR, that is, a wonderfully flawed example of, a thing that's kind of okay. It's like, okay. But it does kind of play this role of kind of the tail wagging the dog, something that many kind of companies and corporations need to comply with for a certain market. And therefore they're like, okay, then we're just going to do it for everybody else as well. Do you see that kind of an option? Maybe this is, I'm going to go a little bit broader because I was going into the weeds. How do you see, where do you see the faults and the problems with the US centricity of this conversation, first and foremost? And do you see a way in which, if we look at, regulation or governance, do you see a way in which other groups in the world can act as a balance, or as a counterweight?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, facts. Obviously, these are US companies. They abide by US law. US law governs them in a way that corporations are people. They have First Amendment rights. And so it's actually it's the First Amendment, not Section 230, that enables companies to take down your speech. It's kind of weird, especially for those of us who are not, I am American, but for those who aren't, it's weird to be like, wait, so the First Amendment gives companies the right to censor, but yes, I mean, it does fundamentally. And so, I think those facts out of the way, we have to think about these companies' original intent. I mean, they very much did set out to create, I think Facebook's original mission statement was making the world, no, please don't blank on it. A more open and connected place. There we go. And so, they came at it from that perspective. They signed on to a bunch of agreements in the early days, starting around 2008 with the Global Network Initiative, where they agreed to uphold international human rights frameworks around free speech. And then they just went off and did their own thing after that and forgot about all of their commitments. Some of them are kind of coming back around to that now, but I have to reference the excellent work of David Kay, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on a bunch of things in freedom of expression. Never get it right. It's a long
two
title.
Sentences.
But he put out a great a very small book, but a very persuasive argument for why these companies should be adhering to international human rights standards. And again, a lot of it does have to do with the fact that they're inherently international. US people are a minority on Facebook, as well as most of the other platforms. And so going forward, I mean, since you asked the question, what should we do? I think that I'm of two minds here, although they're not in contradiction with each other. One is that I believe that we need to have a user-powered movement, and that is going to come from, not from me, not from you, probably not from anyone in the West, but it's coming from the global South. And that's where the most interesting conversations around what we could do differently are happening. And so, while in the US, there's all of this, should we or shouldn't we with reforming Section 230, elsewhere in the world, there are other ideas being proposed. And including in Europe with the Digital Services Act, which I think is potentially one of the better pieces of law that we might see in the coming years. At the same time, I think that there's a lot that these companies can do on the self-regulatory basis. And so, assuming these laws don't pass or they aren't satisfactory, or if we just want to see things outside of regulation, first, I always say, right today, they could audit all of their policies. Does it make sense that certain things are banned in 2021? I got 2 whole chapters that argue that there's quite a bit that doesn't. Could they, for example, put forth consent? So, Rebecca made this argument years ago, but could they require users to consent every time there's a policy change? Could they make sure that their terms of service, their community standards, which are the public-facing document, and their internal guidelines are all in order? And of course, could they put forth more transparency in terms of numbers, notice to users, and appeals, due process? These are all very basic things that these companies are highly aware of and yet choose not to do every single day. And inclusivity, of course, is the other one. I'm sure we're going to talk about that more, so I'll leave it for now.
Yeah, and actually we have a question from the QA that I think links back to this, because about, I think the user-powered movement, this is something that I'm going to keep for another question later, because I think that is super worthwhile of its own deep dive. But speaking of self-regulation of the companies themselves, and the question, the Q&A says, in the 90s, there was a sense that the internet, social media was going to be great for global demographics. Now I find myself thinking, actually, it's the new mass culture dominated by corporations and bite-sized ideas. Is this wrong? This, for me, kind of links to the self-regulation point, because And the subheader of your book is about surveillance capitalism. It is, how much can we trust self-regulation if ultimately a company's goal will always be profit?
Yeah. I mean, as a lot of people smarter than me have said, it's the business model, right? And I think the business model is the fundamental problem here. And the business model is surveillance capitalism, which treats us as things to, objects to suck the resources. And that's what's happening there. Shoshana Zuboff describes that so much more articulately than I do. So I'm not happy to quote her, but read her book, it's great. But yeah, it is the business model. And so, I think if I had a motto, movements come out of internet organizing, whether it's in private online spaces, on social media platforms. Obviously there's a couple of different threads there. In one sense, they're used to activity, to things that are happening that might not otherwise be covered by media. On the other hand, I think that's not happening on social media for the most part. It's happening in closed channels, Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I do feel, increasingly like even those incredible movements, and I think the movement for Black Lives is one of the movements that has utilized the internet the most in the past few years, and successfully so. And yet we've seen brands come in and capitalize off that too. And I don't think we're going to see that stop anytime soon. There's also, of course, the incentivization for bite-sized commentary. I mean, Twitter, thankfully, doubled from 140 to 280. I'm sure there are some people who are still mad about that, but I think it's great. And yet, 280 characters to say your piece. No wonder we don't understand each other culturally anymore. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a move towards more complexity of thought. And I don't think that that's going to happen on these platforms.
That's a very good point. And speaking of specifically about the platforms, and connecting back to the inflection point, there's reading the book, it is kind of a historical retelling of certain things happening at a certain moment, and then something shifts, right? Whether it's the big IPO, whether it's the massive influx of money, and so on. During the Arab Spring era, what really kind of captivated me is that what was happening at the moment is that there was the companies were still small enough for single individuals with a spine, with a strong kind of moral compass, to still have the space to act on individual basis, on quickly and efficiently to save somebody's profile from being deleted, to there was that possibility. And people like you, like with the mediators that were capable of getting that connection happen, that still worked. And then of course everything blew up exponentially, so that kind of stopped being kind of a venue, because then everything became corporate speech. And so there's a lot of talk, especially like in the US right now, about splitting up the big four, right? And like in the perfect world, one would think, okay, maybe, if we split them up, maybe we can go back to, a size that's more humanly manageable, so we can have these kind of human conversations. The cynic in me would say it's way too late for that, but I would like to hear from you. Like, do you think if there's like legal frameworks that divide these companies into smaller chunks, do you think we can go back to that moment?
No. So I think competition will solve a lot of things. So on the one hand, we don't want companies like Google and Facebook owning the fiber, which they do. We don't want them being the infrastructure and the platform. So competition is going to solve some problems, but I don't think that it solves the speech problem, so to speak. Crack myself up sometimes. Yeah, and so I mean, I don't know that we'll ever go back to that moment in time for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, and this, I really don't intend for this to sound elitist, but I keep getting it out wrong. So I'm going to try here. The conversation was a very different group of people back then. It was much smaller. It was much less global. And of course, in any homogenous group, you're not going to have the same level of contention that you are when the entire world of various backgrounds and classes and all of that is participating in these conversations. And so I don't think that that's a problem. I want that. I'm very much an internationalist in that sense, but at the same time, like, that requires us to think about speech in a different way than the way that folks in the US context do. And that's really what I see as the fundamental problem there. And so again, totally pro-competition, but not at the expense of other solutions and other reforms.
Yeah, or it's not going to be enough, basically. It's a good step
it's not going to be enough.
Something. Yeah. And do you think, like, again, looking back at all of these like inflection points, do you think there were moments in which things could have gone differently? Like, were there moments in which things could have gone left instead of right, and we wouldn't be where we are right now? Or is this was this an inevitable trajectory?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think that if Mark Zuckerberg had climbed down from his little pedestal at some point and actually talked to a human being that wasn't on his executive team, I think things could have gone really differently. I mean, it's funny because, like, I get into the nuance. I get the sense that Twitter doesn't hate me, right? But like Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg pretends I don't exist, and it's great. But, looking at the differences in these companies, I want to just use those two as an example because I assume that the vast majority of people are on one or the other one. If you're not, bless you. But Twitter is a much smaller, not very profitable company, right? And I talk to folks at that company quite regularly, and I can tell as an outsider, I'm not privy to much that other folks aren't, but I can tell that there's meaningful debate happening inside of those hallowed halls. And that they're really, trying to get to the core of some of these issues. They're getting it wrong. I disagree with them on a lot. But even looking at Jack Dorsey's trajectory over the past decade, it's been kind of interesting. You've seen him step away, come back, found another company, change his political perspective, go on these retreats in Myanmar during a genocide. I don't know what that was all about. But nevertheless, I think that there's thought happening there. With Facebook, it's basically an authoritarian regime at this point, and it didn't have to be that way. You see in the book that, a decade ago when how do I describe myself? I was basically a project manager at an academic institution without an academic background, and Sheryl Sandberg was emailing me, right? So like, she didn't know I was, I didn't matter to her. And yet back then they were willing to have those conversations. And in fact, I think this story might be interesting to folks who haven't gotten their hands on the book yet. My first contact with Facebook was because I caught them out on, actually, I didn't catch them out. I got to give credit to the person who did. But I spotted it and connected it and wrote about it. That they had blocked the word Palestinian from being put into the creation of a page. So somebody noticed this. He tried to create a page that was like, I don't remember, it's in the book, but off the top of my head, like, let's say, Palestinian activism central, and he couldn't create the page. So he tried like Palestinian music, couldn't create that page. And so I kept testing it, and it was the word. We figured out it was that word. And so I wrote about it, like, what is happening at Facebook? What's up with these racists? And they emailed me, and they were like, and it was one, I won't name him, but like one person emailed me and was like, hey, thanks for finding that. It was a bug. We fixed it. Who knows? Was it? But also, they wanted to keep the channel open. And over the next couple of years, I had a lot of conversations with them. And then, things started to grow. These platforms started to get bigger, and they started to close off the communication.
Yeah. I love the fact that most of the problems when they get caught.
Issue.
Can you hear me? Hello? Are we having web issues? 1 2 1 2. Okay, we have the room says that they can. Oh,
I think it's me.
Yay! Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Excellent.
We have terrible internet in Berlin.
So now we have a little bit of a delay. So this is going to be one of those fantastic moments when, I stop talking and then you start talking, and then I start talking again, because we are basically on a satellite, like coming to you from the forest of. I love the fact that, so many times Facebook, especially Facebook, comes out and says, oh yeah, no, we are sorry for this technical error. A very clear problem has been pointed out, and it usually just gets, kind of wrapped up, yeah, it was a glitch. Oh, we're sorry, we fixed the bug. And there's no way of knowing anything about what that bug was, whether it was a bug, what actually happened. But it's like a very, very easy kind of, technology first solution to slap onto anything that they get caught with. the lack of accountability and the lack of transparency will always kind of, bite all of these projects. I mean, all of our kind of activism projects from the outside, it's like not being able to know whether a certain kind of push actually resulted in meaningful change will always be a limit, like a big wall. And then there's the Facebook Oversight Board, which is, of course, which is kind of sort of a thing that's happening right now. And it's like, here's the thing: I see the Facebook Oversight Board as a really good security theater that is meant to write its own articles, while at the same time, and again, I feel like we are doing this dichotomy between Jack the good guy and Mark the bad guy. But still, I know that on Twitter's side, conversations do happen with way more with nonprofit organizations and activists. They're kind of not really publicized, but they actually enact some meaningful change. What's a third option? Like, is there a third option without a law?
Yeah. I mean, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic. So, and I have to say on the Facebook Oversight Board that I was so relieved when I had to submit the manuscript before all of the real details came out. Because I was like, oh my God, I don't have to write about that in the book. Because it is a mess. Although I have to say, like, I am happy with some of the ways it's progressing. No, look, I mean, I think that I don't want to argue for a third way, because I actually think that it's a combination of the two existing ways, regulation and self-regulation, that's going to actually be the answer. And I think, unfortunately, and this is not an exciting answer and nobody really likes to hear it, but it's going to come down to process. A lot of this stuff is really boring and annoying. And yet, some of the biggest changes that I've seen at these companies in terms of policy have come from public pressure. So to give a really clear example of that, back in 2014 or 15, God, my memory is garbage, pandemic, right? But yeah, 2014 or 2015, there was a situation where a number of drag performers in the San Francisco Bay Area were just systematically wiped off Facebook all at once. And some of them were quite connected with the tech community and knew about content moderation issues. And so they immediately pegged it as, this happened because we were not using our real names, and Facebook requires real names. Now it's called the authentic name policy, but here's why. Those folks became aware of it, organized with folks in the tech nonprofit area, as well as folks inside the companies, as far as I know, and staged real life protests in front of these companies' headquarters, went to Facebook, had protests there. There's photos of it online. They're fantastic. And as a result, they managed to change the policy. So Facebook changed it so that you could use a version of your real name, your authentic name. Now, unfortunately, I've got a couple of critiques of this. One is that it took essentially a group of mostly white US people to make that change happen. And the second one was that those changes were initially and only rolled out in the United States and still have not been kind of amended in a way that's meaningful to a lot of people outside the US. And so I think that there's definitely benefits to continuing to push back against these companies and to grow this movement, but we have to be realistic about what the limitations of that are.
There's again, pandemic brain. Pre-pandemic, I read an article that was making the case on about the building codes for the internet. Basically saying, if you're building a house, that house needs to be livable by humans. Therefore, you need to have certain codes. At the same way, if you're building a social media, like if you're building an online forum, that forum will be lived by humans. Therefore, you should, abide by certain codes, which kind of brings me back to your point of process. Building codes are process. But again, no, this is not a question to you, because the only question would be here: do you think building codes for the internet would be good? Yes. Also, who will implement it? Who knows?
There's a reason people don't like working in local government, right? Like,
yeah.
It's not fun.
Exactly. Yet they move everything, and everything moves thanks to them. But so, and this is kind of like we were mostly talking about, how we got here and what were the kind of the big inflection points and what happened in the past. I guess for me then, right now, without going too much into details, because I'm assuming people both want to read the book, but what are the real life implications of this for starting from the activists and the groups that are most vulnerable? So not the white men with the beard.
Not Trump.
What are the implications? What are the implications of this system of this being our kind of social media environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's obviously a large number of groups affected. The book doesn't cover them all. I'm not going to cover them all. But let's start with the people who often do not have other platforms. Now, one of those obvious groups is folks living under repressive governments, who don't have access to the media, who don't have other channels, who maybe can't even blog. Maybe their blog got blocked. That's a common theme in a lot of the countries that I write about and have worked in. And so if you don't have another place to speak, if you don't have the speaker's corner and you're going to be like, that's where social media comes in and has been really helpful, because the cost of blocking these platforms for a lot of governments is too high. And we've seen that. And that's why we've seen over the years that the platforms often respond favorably to government demands to take content down. Turkey was one of the first ones, but over the years, it's really spiraled out. So that's one really obvious example. Another, and this really kind of came to the fore for me in the pandemic, is people engaged in sex industries. So during the pandemic, and let me even just say adjacent to sex industries, I'm not going to get into the prostitution debate right now, but let me use a very mild example, which is I live in Berlin, where burlesque is very, very popular. And I've got friends who work in the burlesque industry, that seems wrong, but who dance burlesque. And when the pandemic hit, they all found themselves really quickly booted off of pretty much every platform except Twitter, which is the one that kind of has exceptions around the human body, and particularly the female body. And these folks had no other way to make a living. In Germany, if you're a freelancer, you only qualified for some very, very small benefits, basically probably the same level of the US stimulus package. Whereas if you are an employed person here, you qualify for a lot. And so those folks really had nowhere else to go, no other ways to make money, and they couldn't even do their live streams on Twitch or YouTube or whatever. And when we exclude an entire group of people who are working in a perfectly legal field, no less, from making a living, let alone people who are working in fields that are less legal, and I would still support that. But that to me just really drove it home. And you could say the same thing about, and I have, about the marijuana industry in countries where that's legal. I've got lots of critiques there, but marijuana is completely legal in Canada, but you can't advertise it on any of these platforms, even if you're in Canada. The florist who sells flowers can, the person selling vegetables at the market can, but not this plant. It's not bizarre.
This specific plant.
Not this specific plant, yeah. So yeah, I mean, those are just two examples. I think, one of the other groups that's been affected a lot over the years is, of course, the LGBTQ communities around the world who, are often the target of a number of different policies and who are more affected by policies such as those requiring a real name.
Yeah. And also, I know you worked on this a lot, and there's a big part of the book about this, but the whole kind of the concept of censorship, specifically on the human body, that pervades the systems, that is basically designed around the mentality of a lost Harvard graduate, not even the common US citizen, but a very specific subset of the individuals, and then just gets blanket implemented in the entire world is just mind-boggling to me. And again, I don't know why Twitter always kind of comes out slightly better, but Twitter kind of sees it a little bit better. This point about not being able to having this moral authority coming from people who don't, in any way present any kind of moral kind of expertise or skill set to deliver it, is a massive problem, and sometimes a problem of literal livelihood of people, like in your examples. What are your thoughts on that, and how would you see that improving or changing?
Yeah, it's funny. I talked to a German journalist today who asked me, like, so I wrote in the book, if Facebook's rules had been made in Germany, everything would look very different. And of course, there would be censorship, right? Like, you wouldn't be able to talk, you wouldn't be able to deny the Holocaust. Clearly, you would not be able to engage in certain hate speech. You probably could be naked. So I would prefer it for sure, but not everyone would, right? And so I think that. Sorry, I'm getting off track, aren't I? Tell me again where you wanted me to go.
So how do we know? What are your thoughts about, like, how can we? Is there a way in which we can, like, act upon changing the kind of this fundamental premise of this, like, Puritan censorship culture that's just global at this point?
Yeah. Of course. Sorry. So thinking about this, I mean, I think that the U.S. is particularly strange on this, and also kind of all powerful in a lot of ways, right? So the U.S. has the sex sells in the United States, and that's completely true. And yet, obscenity is often one of the biggest exceptions to speech that very few want to acknowledge. Entire books have been written about how much this goes unacknowledged. And it's not always legal in the US. And in fact, Sesta Fosta, which came out a couple of years ago, is it was really the first big limitation around Section 230, the first big reform of it. And it's a very problematic law that impacts far beyond just people who do sex work, but it also affects, people who are just engaged in sharing information about sex, sexuality, and the human body. And so how do we fight back against this? I mean, I think we have to make ourselves known, but I also think we have to take the power away from the United States. Wow, that sounded like I'm fomenting revolution. Which sure, but no, I guess what I mean there is why do we keep putting the companies there? There's been this argument that, it's better for speech. And in some ways it is, but in other ways there are other priorities out there. And I think that as long as we're consenting to what the rules are, then it's better to have a diversity of platforms, right? Like I'm fine with there being a multitude of platforms to choose from, which all have different rules about speech. Remember when Ravelry, the knitting site, booted politics? Like, you can't talk about politics here. This is about knitting. Great. Let's have more of that, please.
Adam Greenfield now just wrote in the comment, and a really fantastic question. Also, Adam, I'm glad you're with us. Yay! Yay! And he's talking about the culture shear between places where content is generated and the generally more conservative places where it's moderated. And do the companies even recognize this as an issue? Which, remind me about the whole Philippines being the main focus of content moderation in Southeast Asia because they are a Catholic country.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to have a really disjointed answer because there's so much that I want to talk about. So let me explain the Philippines thing real quick. And I got to give credit to the folks who made the film The Cleaners, and they brought me in to do a little consulting on that. But they really did an incredible job. If you haven't seen this film, find it. It was put out by Arta.
It's fantastic.
It's really good, and we were with them actually when that happened.
In Bosnia, in Sarajevo, yeah.
Small world. But yeah, the film goes into how a lot of the people who are cleaning up the internet for us, and a lot of us internet users are in the global north, are making higher wages than the folks who are doing that, or most of us are making higher wages than the folks who do that job, who are incredibly underpaid, under-resourced, often come away from the job with mental health issues. And it's a terrible job. Content moderation is a terrible job, which explains why all these companies are trying to outsource it to machines. But yeah, to get more to Adam's point, that's what he meant. Okay, cool. So yeah, looking at the Philippines, it's a really interesting problem because on the one hand, you have the content moderators there. On the other hand, you actually have over the past few years a massive war on drugs, and not just war on drugs, but drug users pushed by Duterte, who has, literally extrajudicial killings of drug users. And Facebook has had to respond to that. And actually, there was a piece of news yesterday in The Guardian. And I think the Philippines is one of the countries that has some special provisions around what the rules are. And so this is one of those issues where this, Myanmar, a lot of the Middle East and North Africa is where the companies have to kind of, not say have to, because I don't always agree with it, but have ended up kind of modulating their rules a little bit to respond to things, and sometimes in very problematic ways. So I want to describe this one just because this combination of things has not been in the media yet. I don't think the story's out there completely. So here, fresh off my brain. So yesterday, The Guardian put out this report that documented some kind of private sets of rules that basically mean that people in certain jurisdictions, and I'm going to use Lebanon as an example because it makes a lot of sense here, people in certain jurisdictions, including Lebanon, have kind of broader rules than we do here in Europe or the United States about what we can say about non-state actors. So what this means in practice is that in Lebanon, where you have Hezbollah, which is listed by the US and by some other countries as a terrorist organization, but also has members in parliament, very tricky, there's a lot about them in the book, that people there are rightfully allowed to have broader conversations about that group than I am. Now, I mean, rightfully, I say because I think it's necessary. I would change the rules entirely, but that's just me. Yeah. Yet at the same time, and this is the part that's not completely out there, at the same time, the Facebook also restricts some of its LGBTQ products to users in that region. And so on the one hand, they're allowed to talk positively about a group that the US calls a terrorist group. And on the other hand, they can't promote pride. Like, it's just a very strange dichotomy that I already saw a number of people on social media in my network today, some of whom are from Lebanon, say that basically like Facebook's helping their government. They're supporting, bad ideas, to say the least. And sorry, I feel like I'm not being as articulate about this as I would be during the day. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean, that's just one example of many where these companies are putting forward contradictory and confusing rules that make it very clear that they don't often, they've got kind of two hands of this happening. They're not often, what's the phrase, shaking each other. Whew.
Yeah. which kind of goes to your point in the book about how all the rules and policies right now are kind of a layer peeled backward, an onion peeled backwards. There's no rhyme or reason. People just corporations figure out rules as they go, and usually they use the kind of the path of least resistance when they can, unless there's a massive public outrage. So what's happening in Lebanon is that was just the easiest way of getting to sell advertising in Lebanon through the social media platform. And Nina,
no, absolutely right. I mean, that's where the decisions come from. That's why they originally, and this time I'm talking about YouTube as well. It's why these companies initially responded to Turkey, because it's one of the world's biggest e-commerce markets. And so getting blocked there would be really bad for business. And so of course they're going to say, sure, we'll comply with your law that you can't insult somebody who's been dead for 100 years. Sure, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And this kind of brings me to one of the points about what can we do about this? And you write a little bit of directions of how we should be thinking about this in the future. One really struck with me, and that was instead of having companies design massively complex legal architectures and frameworks and policies that inevitably changed as the context changes. And having grown up in Croatia, I know how context can change massively in 100 kilometers 7 times. One of the options you're saying is, why, if we are developing these strong algorithmic tools to self-filter and kind of define what can or cannot go through, why not just give those tools to the users? Why can't I, Tin, decide that I want to see the nipple, but I don't want to see rice because I don't know, I'm particularly against rice. I think that's a really interesting one. So,
So I mean, I don't want to see NFTs, frankly.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Timely joke. Yeah, no, this is really interesting to me because I heard through a little bird that Facebook had actually been considering this very idea a few years ago, and from what I heard, Sheryl Sandberg was the one to strike it down. And the idea is exactly what you said, where we have the technology now. AI is not good at a lot of things. It's not good at detecting nuance in speech, but what it is really good at is putting things in boxes. If you've got, let's say, nipples are actually a terrible example for a number of reasons. So let's use this is a face mask. This isn't a face mask. Yeah. AI can do that binary pretty easily. And so if you don't want to see face masks, flip the switch. They could give you that tool today, but they choose not to. And the really interesting thing is there's a bunch of other practical uses for it, right? Not just nudity, where some people, for whatever cultural values may not wish to see that, or maybe they're at work, but also things like you got a snake phobia, turn off the snake filter. Why not? Hate rice? Go for it.
Rice. which to me, it's such a fantastic point. And what makes me think is, what is the reason why this didn't get through? And the kind of coming from like a more of a technological background, the first thing that comes to my mind is they didn't want to do it because their algorithms are bad, which is very much a possibility. And doing this will just show people how bad they actually are. But maybe not. Maybe there's just a business case for not having it. And at the end of the day, it's money, right?
I mean, I wish I knew. I feel like their executive level team is an impenetrable fortress. Like the people that so Alex Stamos is one of the more unspoken people who's been at that level at Facebook. He was their chief technical CTO. Was he CTO or chief security officer?
I think he was chief security officer.
Chief security officer.
Yeah.
And he was, I have to say, like, I mean, I do consider him a friend, but he was really incredible back then. I didn't know him when he was working there. He brought me in to talk to his team. And I got to say, like, he had an amazing team, mostly men, which was a little disappointing for me. But nevertheless, it was an incredible, thoughtful team of people that he put together. And I thought, wow, okay, Facebook could be like this. When you asked earlier, what could things have gone differently? Yeah, I mean, if somebody like him had stayed, or they'd hired more people like him, but instead they continue to hire from law enforcement and government, which I think is kind of how they've ended up where they are. Nick Clegg, Monica Bickert, all of these people have that kind of background.
Yeah. We have another question from Nick Stevenson in the Q&A, and I would say, since it's 10 to the full hour, strangely enough, I would keep going for 2 more hours, but I'm fully opening the floor to questions, and feel free to shoot anything you have at us. This question says, from Nick Stevenson, and this is, I think, a really, really good one to talk about. What do you think of the idea that we should simply refuse Twitter, Facebook, etc., in the same way lots of people refuse the capitalist press? Yes, okay, to Zoom as people like you are writing interesting books, but yes to Zoom as people like you are writing interesting books, but a big no to the rest. And I would have things to say about Zoom as well, but yeah.
Yeah, no, and totally fair. And I think everything you would have to say about Zoom is fair. But yeah, I mean, it's funny that you asked this. I was going to say famously, but it's not really famously. I'm not famous for this, but I absolutely fundamentally refuse to pay for the New York Times. And yet, I still read it. I just paywall it with a VPN. Don't arrest me. I just get around that paywall by having 16 different browsers installed at all times. It's totally normal. So right. So this argument, I'm not opposed to it. I just don't think it's realistic. And I think that, I guess what I am opposed to is these frequent semi-annual, I guess, calls for let's all boycott Facebook that seem to always arise mostly from white American men going like, yeah, let's just all boycott Facebook. That'll solve the problem. It would if everyone were listening, able to do that, spoke English, read your call for action. But I've never seen a call for action around that wasn't just a bunch of people speaking to each other in English around an English language hashtag. And so I think it's fine to morally refuse these platforms. I've got plenty of friends who do. Amazingly, I know people who are just not on social media at all. And I'm like, what do you do with your time? Read books, I hope. But yeah, I think that I don't oppose the idea, but I don't see that as solving the problem. And so it's a fine moral act. Don't get me wrong, but I don't know that it's going to get us anywhere, especially when, and this is the part that I don't want to forget to say, when there are people who don't really have as much of a choice to do that, right? So here we've got all of these different choices. Again, we've got all these different platforms to choose from. I was hanging out with a friend earlier today who said that she gave up Facebook so that, now she uses Instagram. I laughed at that, but I get it, right? Like I get it's a different mental stimulation. But there's folks, again, who are relying on these platforms to get their ideas out there, to push back against their governments. And I think that it's overly simplistic to expect them to give up these platforms when they don't have another media channel to go to.
Yeah. And my addition to that would be also that Twitter and Facebook at their core are distribution vehicles with the power to veto, right? So, saying that, I think the comparison with refusing to read the capitalist press, for me, a better comparison would be refusing to, buy at the newsagents as a concept. And some people just don't have a choice to go but to go there because that's where the information is. That's the new public forum, right? And so, yeah, until we have a good alternative for people to actually express their views and opinions, and for many people to hear about many other people, then, you know, that's my main problem with like why. Well, I managed to get off of Facebook, yes, but I'm not leaving Twitter for sure.
No, totally. And I love Adam's comment here of, I will never forgive the New York Times for the war in Iraq, will never pay them a single cent and read them every day. I actually, every few years, I pay them the 99-cent trial fee just so that I can call up and yell at their customer service and explain to them why I'm quitting again. It's like, it's very cathartic. I highly recommend this. I think last time it was Brett Stevens, but I find a new reason every time.
It's very therapeutic.
Do that with Facebook too. Just, I'm sure they're tracking.
That is fantastic. Or, you know, every time that you try to open the Washington Post from any European country and you get like the big democracy dies in darkness. In order to read this, you have to pay. Great. Mixed messages, but fine. Awesome. So while we wait for other questions in the Q&A, I have a couple for you as well. I was thinking about you know, yes, but actually, like building off of the idea that, you know, what can we do about this? What can the average person actually do? Like, if we think about, yes, we want to create a better system in which there's more kind of public ownership. We want to have a space where there's better self-regulation. Is there anything, or what is there to do for, you know, normal humans that walk around the world doing their own jobs and would like to do something about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways to get involved. Obviously, you know, not everybody wants to become a Section 230 expert. In fact, the people who are Section 230 experts don't really want to be Section 230 experts anymore, from what I can tell. So, you know, you don't have to go that far. And obviously, I think a lot of this audience is not from the United States, so please don't feel like you have to. But if you're here in Europe, actually, a lot of you are probably in UK, so sorry, bye. No, I'm kidding. So in Europe, on mainland Europe, awkward. We can, you know, I think that this is a really great time to reach your representatives in the European Parliament, because there are some votes coming up around the DSA, the DMA, and there's still a lot more educational work to be done. We've got some great members of some MEPs right now, but only a handful who really know this stuff. Right now, there's the terrorism regulation in Europe as well, which is very troubling and would require companies to take down content deemed to be terroristic within 1 hour, which is not possible. And so, yeah, get involved around that stuff, share what's happening. EDRI in Europe, the European Digital Rights Initiative, is really fantastic on this stuff. They know what they're talking about. In the UK, the Open Rights Group is a great group to get involved with, volunteer with, help out. But yeah, I think otherwise, just getting informed about the issues, helping to inform your lawmakers, who you are probably often more informed than, and yeah, pushing back against these companies when you can. I mean, I think that I don't like the media ecosystem right now, and I don't like the just rapidity of some of these debates. Like, I think I saw some news about Slack that I thought was kind of interesting, and then 20 minutes later, they were like, actually, no, we reversed that feature. And I was like, it was, you know, my head spun. But at the same time, I think that, you know, this is the moment we're in, and we can use it to our advantage. When you see these stories come out, if you're on social media and you see these stories come out about things that Facebook did, really start like bothering their employees. They're all on Twitter all the time, and some of them get really nasty with people. But if you've got the fortitude for that, like, I think that they are listening in some cases. And there are, as we saw with Google this past year, I mean, this isn't my bread and butter, so I didn't touch on it in the book, but there were some really incredible, powerful movements coming from inside of Google. I know some of those organizers, they're really wonderful people. And, you know, I think finding ways to support them as well. I know that they've done a lot of mutual aid work over the past year, and there's lots of ways to get involved with them.
And of course, you know, I mean, this is, I swear I did not think about this as a pitch, but, you know, buying books from authors that work on this, and, you know, yes, but also like donating to organizations that work on this work, because, you know, it's not for everybody's stomach to go on Twitter and, you know, be particularly kind of vocal on it. So I think there's always a space to, you know, find the right organization to support them, right?
Yeah, in fact, and on the book front, this is a very ugly formatted blog post, because I still don't really know how to do anything on my new website. But there's a bunch of really incredible books coming out in the next couple of months. And I put together a little mini list that folks can check out.
Yes, please. Thank you.
It's in the chat.
Fantastic. I just opened it. You mentioned something right now, because I know it's the full hour, and we've been kind of it's been suggested that 60 minutes is a good set of time, but I'm just going to ask this extra question, and if people just want to drop off, we love you and we respect that.
Folks have stuff to do. It's cool. Also,
the question about, there you go. I made the mistake of bringing water with me. That was a rookie mistake.
Always bring both, Ken.
Right. But so talking about legislators, and more importantly, about the massive digital divide between the technologies that needs to be legislated and the capacity of the legislature to even understand what we're talking about. And we've all seen, bits and pieces, of course, on social media of the Congress and the Senate drilling big tech CEOs and asking incredibly dumb questions, like why does my phone do something? It's like it felt like Thanksgiving with the family when somebody's like, why is my phone in horizontal mode? But and I know there have been some senators who have worked with great kind of human rights activists and people like Crystal Goyan, who went to work with, I don't remember which congressman.
I think it was.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's great.
In the US, and there are these examples, and there are some MEPs who are particularly good at it. But at the same time, if we look at globally, generally, from like all of my experiences from the countries I lived in, from Italy to Croatia, to the Netherlands and so on, the average level of understanding of what we're doing is so far back. How do we deal with that? What does education look like? What do we do?
I love that you brought up the Netherlands, because their favorite thing to do is like, let's just start a new commission, a high-level commission. Like every couple of years, there's a Dutch high-level commission that's completely non-inclusive of civil society and academia. No, so what should we do on that level? So I got to say, I came into a lot of this a few years ago when this work began to escalate, not really understanding all of these laws myself, and I still don't. And I think that I have to admit that because, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal over the past few weeks, months, years, whatever. What time is it? They've actually gotten 230 wrong on a regular basis. They've spread misinformation about this law. We've seen it come from lawmakers as well. And so, yeah, write a book and that's how you get to know it. No, but I'm kidding. I think in terms of education around this, I do think that I don't know what the state of public education is these days with the kids, but I know that when I went to school, a lot of the stuff that I learned, not only would I call some of it pure disinformation around the US war machine and things like that, but a lot of it was also deeply outdated. I remember distinctly that my history book in high school was from the 70s and I went to high school in the late 90s. So I think that we've got to update education to so that kids understand these issues from the beginning, so that we're raising a next generation of young people who are smarter than we are about the internet. And also, I think we also can't forget that there's another next billion users, many of whom are going to already be adults who may not know. We've seen, Facebook has gone into a lot of countries. Tunisia was one of them, India, not going to remember any others right now. I think Myanmar as well, which frankly, I think played a role in the genocide there. Facebook went into a lot of these countries offering free data services, free connections to Facebook. So here, have some free data and we'll only let you connect to Facebook and maybe Wikipedia. And so if Facebook is playing that role as service provider and doing it for free, no wonder people are going to think that Facebook is the internet. I know that that's become a bit of a trope at this point, but still, when it's there and it's free, of course, people are going to use it. And that's why we're all on these platforms, right? Because they don't cost anything. But they do. They cost our data. They cost our dignity. I think they're kind of costing us democracy and humanity at this point. So yeah, education from every level. And, for those who want to be more involved in this, you don't have to work in advocacy or academia to get more involved. There's now an increasing number of channels, including really excellent, they're not conferences, they're more like festivals. The Internet Freedom Festival is one great one. I know they're kind of shifting around what to do in our less in-person era. But that's one fora. It's usually held in Valencia, Spain, where I meet some of the most incredible people people from all around the world every year. I see Rima sending a heart. Rima's one of those people.
Nice.
But it's such an incredible, diverse community, and I've learned more than I've given to it. And so I think that's it. You've got to be part of an international movement these days for any of this to work.
Yeah, that's a good point. The question is how do we get the legislators to come to the Internet Freedom Forum as participants and not as keynote speakers, right?
Yeah, I gave you a really bad answer on the specific legislators one, but if only I knew.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the US example, Ron Wyden is the only one actually writing sensible legislation around this stuff, because Chris has been here with him for like 4 or 5 years at this point, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, he's been doing great stuff. We actually, EFF gave him one of our Pioneer Awards, I think back in, I would say circa like 2011. So he's been doing this stuff for a long time. Ron has. But in the US, there's very few. In Europe, we've got Patrick Breyer and Karen Melchior doing amazing work. There's some others as well that I don't know as much. I will say this, actually. Patrick is a great example. I don't want to call him out, but he's gotten engaged in some of the mailing lists that civil society run, and he shares his own updates with us, which is kind of unprecedented, frankly. Wow. And so it is possible. It is possible. I mean, mind you, he's coming from a very progressive part of politics, but I think like Karen Melchior, as I mentioned, she's a Danish MEP. She's super, super engaged on Twitter, and a lot of folks know her. She's been to the Internet Freedom Festival. So it can happen. It's definitely a bigger challenge in the US and possibly the UK, but it can happen. Let's invite them.
Then that is a very good point. Yeah, let's open those spaces and let them come over. And if they need some, if they're open to some training and some education, we are more than happy to do that as well. But it was kind of back to the question of who wants to do the bureaucracy job. Like, we need the maintenance people to help out with this stuff. I spent a bunch of my work has always been around like, how do we help municipalities figure out how to better manage their data and be better at that. And at the end of the day, it is literally a question of getting people who have rarely opened a computer to become incredibly comfortable with Excel. And that is kind of the baseline is what kind of needs to change. I think, like, generally, overall, from the governmental perspective, there is a baseline of kind of ambient knowledge, general understanding of technology that again, I have no idea how to do it, but so I'm gonna.
Yeah, but actually, you since we bring local government one more time. Oh, sorry.
Be right. Go.
Am I frozen?
I can hear you. We have a delay, but if you want to go, go.
Oh, okay. Just to add on to that and just say, let's never forget the aides too. It's often not the elected officials, but the people who work for them that are easiest to bring to the table. 100%.
And with that being said, I would like to ask if anybody in the group still has any questions to shoot at us. We have the Q&A, and
I can't hear Tin. I don't know if folks can hear me.
I can hear you. I don't know if people can hear us.
Yeah, I'm back, but I think some folks are needing to go.
So let's call this a moment where the internet gods are telling us we should start wrapping this up. Thank everybody for coming, and it was great to have you here. Jillian, your moment to shine. Pitch your book. Tell us your Twitter account, your everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's Silicon Values. It's easy to find. Apparently in the US, it's even at Walmart, which kind of blew my mind. But don't buy it there. Buy it from versobooks.com. It's a great place to order it from. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here. You can follow me on pretty much all the platforms at Jillian C York, but I mostly, unfortunately, spend my time on Twitter. So if you want to chat, that's where to do it. And I appreciate you all so much for being here and listening. And thank you, Tin, for stepping up and doing this. This is such a fun conversation.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you for having me. And Adam, thank you for letting me have your space, and hope everything's great with you, and enjoy your night. And yeah, see you on Twitter.
Yeah, see you on Twitter.
Bye.